And the end of sin, the wages of sin is death, verse 23 in Romans 6. So we know that's bad. That's things you need to run from. When you're teaching children to stay away from a thing, what do you try to instill in them? Fear, right? Now, it doesn't always work, because some children really don't have that innate self-preservation thing. Some have different levels of that, and sometimes we learn. I remember he was talking about some trauma unlocks for me as a child. The space heaters, right? The kerosene space heaters. What happens with those? This is back before they put the metal cages around it. You know what I'm talking about? And, there's this new thing in the house. Well, as a child, you want to touch it. And my parents told me, I was told several times to stay away from it, but what ended up happening? I touched it. That thing's hot. Guess what I stayed away from after that? Obviously, right? So we learn lessons. We learn to fear a thing and we stay away from it. What happens is sometimes we're not learning enough to stay away. There was another childhood instance. I'm sharing so much of myself with you guys because I'll leave eventually. But my grandmother had this cat, which she gave to me. I have it in my house right now. In my home, not my trailer, right, Karen? Not the trailer. All right, so it was this little cat. I don't know why, but I just wanted to touch that cat. And my parents were like, don't touch the cat, you'll break it. It's this little porcelain cat thing. And so if you can't touch it with your hand because your hand got smacked, guess what I tried to do? Touch it with my foot, right? So that's what happens. Sometimes we are taught to fear a thing, but we're going to see how close can we get to it before we really understand that we need to stay away from it altogether. And that's what the Bible tells us to do, flee things. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul's talking to the church there in Corinth. Corinth is known for its idolatry. Part of idolatry in that time was temple, the worships and all the temple that they had. Part of that temple worship was prostitution. Right? That's how they adored their God and had prostitution. And so he's saying here in chapter 6, verse 18, flee immorality. And in this context, he's talking about joining yourself with a prostitute or the temple harlot. Every other sin a man commits is outside of the body, but the immoral man sins the immoral man sins against his own body. He's saying flee, run away from this. It's everywhere there in Corinth. Run away from it. And this is the very same thing when we think about Joseph and Potiphar's wife and how she was trying to entice him. At the end, she set up the circumstances. There was nobody in the house. They were there by themselves. She created this environment to trap him in something. And he recognized in that moment, the only way for me to get out of this is to run, right? Beat feet and get out of here. And that was what he needed to do in order to get away from that thing. And that's what Paul's telling them here. Flee. Run away from these things. He tells them later on in the same book in chapter 10, verse 14, therefore, my beloved, flee idolatry. Run away from it. Run away from it. And if we're teaching and we're learning, there are certain things that we need to flee from and run away from. In 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 11, in Paul's relationship with Timothy and instructing him on how to be a minister, how to work amongst the congregation, and he gives him obviously lots of information. And one of these things he tells them to flee things in both the first and second letter that he writes to them. He says, but flee these things. Flee these things, you man of God, and pursue righteousness. And so ahead of what we're talking about in the context is the love of money, which is the root of all sorts of evil, which is evident, has always been evident. How many things that are happening that we see happening because of the love of money? How many evils have happened because of the love of money? And he talks about earlier in this chapter about contentment and learning to be content with the things that we have. But he says, flee those things and then pursue. Also in 2 Timothy chapter 2, maybe just a page over, 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 22. Therefore, if anyone, we're beginning verse 21, let's back up a little bit. Therefore, if anyone cleanses himself from these things, there it is again, being, talking about being a vessel of honor, and talking about those who were unashamed workmen, and actually naming some of those who were not acting like they should, but would cleanse himself from these things, he will be a vessel for honor, sanctified, useful to the master, prepared for every good work. Now flee youthful lusts and pursue righteousness. So here again, he's telling him, flee. There are things, Timothy, you need to flee. To be a good workman, to be what you're supposed to be, there are things that you don't play with. There are things that you don't try and get close to. There are things that you just need, when you see them, to run. Flee these things. And we understand what dangers are. And we understand when danger approaches, we want our children to run. We want them to stay away from those things. It's something that we understand. But in fleeing, there needs to be an idea of pursuing something also. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 26, therefore I run in such a way as not without aim. And I box in such a way as not just beating the air. I'm not just shadow boxing when I'm doing these things. I'm not just running aimlessly across anywhere. If you're competing in anything, running track or anything like that, you're focusing on the goal. You're running a set standard. You're running as best you can toward a goal, toward a destination. And the same way with boxing, obviously, you have an object that you are boxing about. So there are things that we need to be focusing on when we're fleeing. And so as we flee and we transition from a fear-based thing or recognizing danger and fleeing away from it, we need to be pursuing something. And that's what he says to Timothy in both of these sections of Scripture. Flee these things, but don't just run aimlessly. If I'm, again, just running because of fear and I'm fleeing something, I might run into danger again somewhere else, just like those horror movies. But if I'm fleeing something but pursuing something, that changes my motivation, that changes my perspective. And I want us to recognize that, yes, we need to understand that there are certain things we need to flee. But if I'm focusing on the things that I need to pursue, do I have to think about the things I need to flee anymore? Does that become my focus? I'm not living just to avoid things. I'm living to pursue a thing. Do you see how that might change our motivation? It might change kind of how we live and pursue a thing. So when I'm pursuing something, he says in Romans chapter 14, Romans 14 verse 19, he says, so then we pursue the things which make for peace and the building up of one another. Pursue, chase after something that builds up peace. In the same way the Hebrew writer writes, Hebrews 12 verse 14, pursue peace with all men and sanctification, without which no one will see the Lord. How important is peace with all men? I need to make sure I'm pursuing after peace. Make for the things that means I'm working for it, I'm chasing after it. How many of you have ever chased after a thing or pursued something because you really wanted it? Or you've seen somebody else do that? Maybe some certain animals, sometimes certain dogs get on a scent, and man, they are after that thing. It takes forever to get them off that scent. In the same way, we need to be pursuing these kind of things. Pursuing peace is one thing he mentions here. In verse 1 of 1 Corinthians chapter 14, 1 Corinthians 14 verse 1 says, pursue love. Why would he say that? Why would he say that? What did he just get done talking about? Love, right? That's the love chapter, 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Pursue love is what he says in verse 14. The best of all things, the greatest of all these is love. Chapter 14, verse 1, pursue love. Chase after love. That's what we need to be pursuing. Pursue, yet desire earnestly spiritual gifts. And he talks about those. That's another context, another sermon for another day. But pursue, chase after love. And we'll talk more about that in just a moment. As we go back to 1 Corinthians 6 and 1 Timothy 6 and 2 Timothy chapter 2, when he's saying fleeing these things, he says, flee these things, you men of God, and pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, perseverance, and gentleness. Do you see what he's saying? These things right here, run away from these. Run away from them. Run away if you're going to survive, okay? That's what one poet once said. But we pursue these things. Righteousness, godliness. If I'm pursuing these things, and the same thing he says in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 22, he reminds them of the same thing, righteousness, faith, love, peace, with those who call on the Lord from a pure heart. These are things that I'm chasing after. Why love? Why love? Why do we need to chase after love? Love, as we've studied before, covers a multitude of sin. It's a motivational factor for what we're doing. I pursue love. I'm doing these things because of my love for God and my love for him. And wasn't that what Joseph said? How can I sin against my God when he's done all these things for me? And then likewise, we need to make sure we're pursuing righteousness, pursuing right living, chasing after these things. Again, if I know what I'm supposed to be chasing down, if I know where I'm supposed to be going, I no longer have to focus on fear. Do you see how my motivation changes? Fear-based motivation only works unless I'm afraid of it. But if I get used to it, if I get comfortable around it, do I fear it anymore? People come to Florida and they're afraid of puddles of water. You know why? Because if it's wet, there's an alligator hiding in it, right? So that's why everybody, National Geographic, all the things they've been taught to fear, but you eventually got to get desensitized. Well, I was around the lake all day. I never got chased by an alligator once. That must mean they don't exist. Well, no, they still exist. Up here, it's the buffalo, right? Yep, it is buffalo. It is tourist tossing season, and unfortunately, it's already happening. But there's not that fear that's there. We get comfortable around it, and then we get tossed, right? Things get turned upside down because we get comfortable around it. In the same way, if I'm not avoiding it, and if I'm focusing on that thing that I fear, and then I'm like, well, I'm not hurting. I'm getting close to it. It's not hurting me. Or what? It's only affecting me. I'm not affecting anybody else by doing this thing. What are we doing? We're getting really chummy with that thing that we are supposed to fear, which is exactly what Satan would have us to do. So I no longer fear that thing because I've gotten used to it. But that's where fear-based motivation is a start, but is not the end. So if I transition and I mature, as a mature Christian, or any Christian, we start off with this idea, I want to be saved because I don't want to go to hell. That's a fear-based motivation. I don't want to go to this place. But I do, eventually, as I mature, I move to a love for God, and I want to do what pleases him. I want to serve him, and so my motivation changes, it shifts, and now I'm focusing on ahead. I chase after the goal, the prize of the upper calling in Christ Jesus. Those are things that I'm pursuing now. I'm forgetting those things that are behind, right? Is what Paul says. And I'm chasing after a thing. And so chasing after it, I'm no longer focusing on whatever is behind me. So Philippians chapter 4, beginning of verse 8. Philippians 4, verse 8. Finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is good report, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, dwell on these things, meditate on these things, think on these things you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. Here's some things that we need to do. I need to make sure that my mental state, so I'm focusing on these things. Have you ever heard of that junk in, junk out kind of thinking? Wasn't it, what was his name? Motivational speaker back in the day before they were really cool. Anyway, but that was kind of his way of thinking. It's like junk in, junk out idea. And so Paul here is saying, put righteousness and put good, healthy things into our minds and think and dwell on those things and then practice it. What you've seen and received, and look at how he's using these words here. Learned, received, heard, seen. Like every way that you can learn a thing. If you're this kind of learner, going back to education nowadays, there's different ways of teaching a child or teaching anybody. If you're this kind of learner, you've practiced it, seen it, touched it, do these things. These are the ways you need to practice. This is what you need to do. So when we recognize danger, we are easily convinced to stay away from or run away from it until we're comfortable with that thing. The Bible asks us to flee, which is what we need to do, but not without aim. Flee these things, but pursue after these things. And once we know what we're pursuing, we don't have to be reminded of what we're fleeing. We don't like to be reminded of things that are scary over and over again because then they're no longer scary. But if I'm just trying to avoid danger, a lot of times I might find how close to the line can I get so I'm not exuding too much energies. Does that make sense? This is just how far I need to stay away from this thing, whatever that thing is. And maybe you have a thing in your life that you need to stay away from. This is just how far I need to stay away from it so it doesn't hurt me. But that's not really what the Bible would ask us to do. It says flee it. Put it in the past. Don't look back. Don't become a pillar of salt. And sometimes what happens if we're just living to avoid sin, we live in this kind of unhappy limbo. Have you ever heard of that? This kind of in-between place. The Bible calls it lukewarm, in that I'm doing just enough to stay out of it, but I'm not doing anything to pursue what I need to be pursuing. And I'm this kind of unhappy middle. And that's not where God wants us to be. He has taught us and he has asked us to live, and he has given us life and life abundant. An abundant life is what he's given us. But we do that when we pursue what he's asked us to pursue. So here I want to close with a couple passages. James chapter 4, verse 7. Submit therefore to God. James chapter 4, verse 7. Submit therefore to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. What does Peter say? What imagery does Peter say that is used for Satan? That roaring lion seeking him whom he may devour. Right? That's that fear-based, and that we need that. Sometimes we need to be reminded of the danger. But God is saying through James here that if you stand with God and you resist Satan, now who's afraid? Now Satan is afraid. Do we think about that? When I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, standing with the Father like I'm supposed to be doing, then Satan is afraid. But when I'm out on my own and I'm trying to see how close I can get to danger, that's when he's the roaring lion. When I'm not pursuing the things I need to pursue. We'll close with 1 Peter chapter 3. 1 Peter 3, beginning in verse 10. For the one who desires life, to love and see good days, must keep his tongue from evil, his lips from speaking deceit. He must turn away from evil, and not just flee evil. He must turn away from evil and do good. The Bible gives us direction. Turn away from this, but do this. Do good. He must seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous, and his ears attend to their prayer, but the face of the Lord against those who do evil. So if I'm fleeing, I need to keep fleeing. But I need to run and chase after and pursue the things that God would have us to pursue. Maybe there's something in your life that maybe you've been trying to see how close you can get to it. And you've been burnt, or you've been hurt, and you need to pursue those things that you know you need to pursue, those things you've learned, as Paul talks about. Maybe you're living a life right now and you've never pursued righteousness. You've never pursued after the things that God would have you pursue, and you'd like to start down that path. I want to change my life. I don't want to live in fear anymore. I don't want to live this way. I want to pursue after the things that God would have me to do, and I want to stand with the God that would encourage me and build me up to where that I would be, because of God, something that Satan would fear. If you want that, please come now as we stand and as we sing.